My name is Graham Bannister from Mobility Ways, and I will be facilitating today's webinar exploring the journey to Commute Zero, or as we term it at Mobility Ways, zero carbon commuting. Mobility Ways, for those who don't know the business, is a climate tech provider and the leader in supporting large organisations, both public and private, to measure, reduce and report on their commuting emissions. We are delighted to be hosting this webinar in partnership with Landor Links, exploring the significance of commuting to the overall UK carbon footprint, what has been done so far to decarbonise, and critically, what more needs to be done. In this webinar, we are exploring the decarbonisation of the commute, a Scope 3 emission category, through a local authority lens. This is deliberate, following research conducted by Mobility Ways earlier in 2023 that pointed towards the need for local authorities to do more to baseline their own commuting carbon footprint and develop evidence-led carbon reduction plans specific to staff commute. From the research, we learned that 42% of local authorities had set absolute targets for reducing commuting emissions on their patch, but at least at the time of surveying, only 7% of authorities had baselined their own commuting emissions. As anchor institutions, Mobility Waves believes local authorities should lead from the front and be the ambassador for place and communities when it comes to tackling the climate emergency. Given the number of authorities attending this webinar today, I'm encouraged that this belief is shared and that there is a positive outlook to finding solutions to our transport emission problems. Positivity is important, given last week's news on the weakening of green policy, the scrapping of compulsory car sharing, who knew that was a thing, and the systemic challenges within local government to deliver given persistent funding challenges. All these elements, I'm sure, will be picked up either directly through presentations or via questions. Today's webinar is an opportunity to share insights and best practices, and therefore I'm delighted to share this virtual stage with some stellar individuals. Next slide. Firstly, Greg Marsden, welcome. For those who don't know Greg is the Professor of Transport Governance for the Institute of Transport Studies located at the University of Leeds. Greg will provide decarbonisation insights, commuting context, and highlight the urgent need for action now if targets to decarbonise are to be met. After Greg's presentation, I will facilitate a Q&A with Greg, combining questions submitted as part of registration, along with questions that I'm sure will come through during Greg's session. In that regard, please add questions through the Q&A function and upvote as applicable so that we can focus in on the questions that are most pertinent to the debate. I'm also equally delighted to welcome Craig Rossington and Joe Kay from Oxfordshire County Council. Craig is the Senior Transport Planner and Joe the Strategic Transport Lead for Oxfordshire County Council. Joe and Craig will provide an overview of the Council's statutory local transport plan and provide detail on a planned trial of permit-based traffic filtering deeply into the topics, the opportunities and the challenges being raised. And finally, time permitting, there'll be a wrap-up Q&A with all participants. So again, if you have questions or comments, please do make these known through the Q&A function. Okay, so that sets the scene. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Graham. Next slide. So, yeah, Graham's already given me an introduction from the Institute for Transport Studies at Leeds. Delighted to be here with you today. So next slide, please. Right, so now that forcing people to share cars is off the agenda, I mean, what shall we do? I'm really grateful for Graham for inviting me to talk about where we are on carbon overall in surface transport emissions. And in particular to highlight why I think the commute is still really important to carbon emission reduction and why local authorities and other public institutions can still take a lot of action even in an unfavourable policy climate on this. Next slide. So as most of you will be aware on this webinar, I'd imagine that there are not that many different ways of thinking about decarbonising transport. We can reduce how much we travel. We can change the modes by which we travel to less carbon intensive modes, and we can improve the technology we use to travel, so that the grams per kilometre for each mile travelled by the different modes are reduced. Click, please. I'm just going to turn my phone off. Sorry, that's one of my daughter ringing. So next slide, please. So the analysis I'm going to show you now comes from the Freedom of Information request I made to the Department for Transport, and the data was released earlier this year. So in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, there were a broad range of outcomes which were forecast in terms of decarbonisation. Very ambitious pathways and less ambitious. Some of which were in line with the Committee on Climate Change's pathways, and some of which weren't. So what I'm showing you here is the road traffic data which underpin that. The green lines are the kind of edge scenarios that were shown in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. So you can see the most ambitious shows road traffic reductions from 2019 levels of about 10%, which last right the way through to 2040. Whereas at the other end, you can see an increase of around 30% in road traffic as a result of high levels of electrification, autonomous vehicles. The Committee on Climate Change projected a very slight increase over the period, broadly speaking, stable for the next decade. So there's a significant range of different outcomes that are being thought through. Now, if we click again, this is the December 2022 National Road Traffic Forecasts. So I've superimposed a number of lines, so it gets really complicated, but there was a scenario behaviour change which suggests that road traffic levels may generally not be on the increase. However, the core scenario, so named, is the red dashed line. So that's projecting traffic level growths above the Committee on Climate Change balanced pathway. And then there are various other outcomes which are, again, higher than that. Click again. So what we see from the National Network's draft planning statement is a belief that under all future scenarios, traffic growth is likely. So we take off basically the shaded area at the bottom. The background traffic growth is going to be positive and above what the Committee on Climate Change recommends. So the question is, are there mitigation measures in place which would bring those road traffic levels down? Otherwise, essentially, we're planning for more traffic than the carbon budget allows us for. Okay, next slide. Then we've got the improved side of things. So this is the statement last week pushing back the end of the sale of fossil fuel vehicles. But most of the pathway is already kind of set in stone by the zero emission vehicle mandate. So that's the red line here. It shows you the percentage of new car sales which are electric each year over the period to 2030. Now, it's quite a steep curve in terms of the percentage of sales, but that flows through into the percentage of miles driven in electric quite slowly, because well, at the moment, let's say we're selling nearly 20% of vehicles which are electric, but that means we're selling 80% of vehicles which are fossil fuel based vehicles. The average vehicle is about 8.5 years old, and vehicles can hang around for 16 to 20 years, although they get driven a bit less when they're older. Anyway, it takes quite a long time for the fleet to renew itself. So if you just click again, you can see in 2030, around 30% of all miles will be driven in electric. By 2037, the end of the 6th carbon budget period, it's closer to 70%. And that's been set in stone now. So click on the next slide, please. Okay, so lots more lines to try and baffle you all with. The green lines, again, relate to private cars, and the black lines relate to light goods vehicles, both of which are important sources of emissions. The the more ambitious lines are the solid lines, so really fast uptake of EVs, and the dashed lines are a less ambitious uptake. What the zero emission vehicle mandate gives us essentially is the red line for cars and the orange line for light goods vehicles. So click again. Essentially for cars, we're taking that part of the policy space away from what had been anticipated to potentially be possible in the transport decarbonisation plan. So we're operating right at the low end, even slightly below the low end of the ambition, even though the zero emission vehicle mandate is going to be difficult to deliver in full. It's less ambitious than we'd previously anticipated. Next slide. And then finally, sitting behind efficiency is also the efficiency of the fossil fuel vehicle cars that we continue to sell over this period. Now, they have been trending downwards as we've had emission standards from the European Commission in play. But recently, as a result of upsizing of cars, more SUVs being sold, we're beginning to see that trend upwards. And obviously, for every fossil fuel vehicle car that we sell that's less efficient than it had been anticipated to be, that's an even bigger gap that we have to fill. So next slide. Okay, so what does this do overall? So the Transport Decarbonisation Plan forecasts the sort of following possibilities, I guess, bounded by the two green lines. So quite a big range. You know, actually it's 40 to 50 million megatons a year different between the upper and lower bound. But the red line represents the carbon budget from the Committee on Climate Change, that what they anticipated the domestic transport sector would achieve. So there were possibilities within the Transport Decarbonisation Plan that performed as well as or better than what the CCC expected, as well as a range of outcomes that were worse. Now, later on in that year, the net zero strategy was published, and the transport sector there was represented by the grey line. So already some of the ambition and some of the worst outcomes had been sliced off. You can see that the grey kind of lines track to a much tighter set of outcomes, some of which were still consistent with the Committee on Climate Change's 6 carbon budget. However, that strategy was subject to legal review, and what was published in March this year for the transport sector is the blue dash line. So if we click on the slide, you can see here essentially the amount of ambition which has been removed from the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. So we're now trending well above what the Committee on Climate Change had suggested, and that was before we saw cuts to active travel funding and before we've seen a kind of negative direction in terms of phase out of fossil fuel vehicles and the language on behaviour change. So I would say some of that space is still at risk as well. So we're heading towards some of the worst outcomes from the Transport Decarbonisation Plan and well out of budget range. Next slide. Oh, right, sorry, next click. Yeah, so just to give you an idea, by 2030, the surface transport sector is anticipated to have reduced its emission by 31% relative to 2019 levels. So what's that, 3% a year? It's well below the 4.5% to 6% which the CCC anticipated over that period. Next slide. What can we do about it? Well, I've just said we've legislated for the electric vehicle transition, so there's no additional capacity to go faster there. In fact, we're talking about going slower. Vehicle efficiency, we're trending behind, so we could maybe get back on trend, but that's not going to save us any emissions. If we look at road traffic then, if we were to reduce our road traffic levels by 20% for all modes of transport, so cars, light goods vehicles and heavy goods vehicles, then we would achieve more or less our CCC 6 carbon budget allocation. We'd be 19 megatons above what we needed to do. Obviously, if we have greater traffic growth, we're going to push even further away. However, if you allow light goods vehicles and heavy goods vehicles to grow, you're looking at reductions of around 50% in car traffic, which I personally believe is unachievable. But if we were to stick with the Scottish targets, then maybe we could get closer to the 6 carbon budget. Next slide. So that's where I think Graham and this webinar come in. What's the importance of commuting? Well, commuting is 19% of all miles. So it's the largest journey purpose in terms of miles driven. And therefore, it's a key sector for us to try and tackle if we're going to reduce the levels of road traffic that we have. Next slide. Rather than being something which is an attack on society, actually, per head of population, the average miles that we've commuted as a society have been falling even before the pandemic. So tackling commuting, I would argue, is going with the grain and something we ought to be talking to society about and businesses and working out how best we can facilitate the commute for those people who have to do it. Next slide. And in theory, we had a supportive policy framework. Well, that's disappeared now, just like the policy framework. But we were proposing to commit to a Commute Zero program. And by 2021, that was going to be established by as part of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Now, you probably have noticed there was no second year update to the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, and we haven't yet seen action, meaningful action on Commute Zero. The next slide. But we can still do an awful lot to lead. Okay, local authorities are really big employers. In fact, the public sector as a whole is a really big employer. 25% of the workforce is in education, public administration, health or social work. And in some places that can be much higher. So Lancashire, for example, is 30%. So I just did some back of the envelope calculations for Leeds the other day. The NHS, 21,000 people employed in the two big hospital trusts, 14,000 by the City Council and 12,000 by the two main universities. If you assume 3 commutes per week, and about 2/3 of that is done by car, we take the distance as 7.4 miles, which is the regional average commute length. That's 1.1 million vehicle miles, which with the average emissions for a car is 164 tons of CO2. If you put that in the context of the Leeds total of 1.184 megatons, that's 8% of transport emissions, which are the commute by major public sector employers. So when Graham was talking about leadership and what can be done, it's a very significant action and one which can certainly inspire some other significant businesses within the region. So next slide. And there are lots of secondary benefits. I'm sure we'll get into talking about some of these in terms of productivity, helping with the cost of living. I know Oxfordshire will talk about supporting wider policy changes. One that's particularly important to me, I think, is grey fleet miles. When people aren't commuting in their own vehicle, they're also not using their own vehicle for work miles. The average age of your own employee-owned car is 6.7 years, whereas when they're provided by the company or by car clubs, etc., it's 1.5 years, and therefore the emissions for every mile driven for business is also lower. So there's lots and lots of secondary benefits that come from tackling the commute. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Next slide, I think we finish and have a discussion. Graham, back to you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Greg. So there's some questions coming through, and I'll have a quick peek at those, but there was several that came through as people were registering as well. But if I just kind of try to summarize a couple of those key points in there, Greg, I mean, so traffic growth increase is with it, that's going to happen. I mean, the traffic is growing. It's a struggle to see how that's going to actually decrease. I mean, electrification is going to play a role in terms of emissions, but it does seem to be a backdrop of increasing traffic. So that piece you mentioned about 20% reduction around the traffic, can you just explain that a little bit more in terms of what that could do in terms of getting us more towards that climate change position?
Yeah, so essentially I built a fairly straightforward spreadsheet model which includes the emission standards which the government has, percentage of miles driven in electric, and the amount of traffic that's on the roads. And I essentially played various different tunes on it to work out what would you have to do in order to be compliant with the 6 carbon budget. And essentially, it's quite significant traffic reduction. So 20% for all vehicles, or as I said, 50% for cars. And the thing is, if we don't act early, then traffic reduction becomes less and less impactful, because more of the fleet is electric, and therefore you don't get as many benefits for every mile removed from the road. But on the other hand, if we don't act early, there's nothing else that's filling the gap. You can't go faster on technology. So the fact that we've had 2 years of drift on Commute Zero, for example, is really problematic, because actually we need that action right now if it's going to make a really significant difference. And I think if we leave it as well, then the cost of motoring gets cheaper for those people who've got an electric vehicle, cost per mile. And therefore, it's going to be even harder to get them out of the car, because it becomes less competitive. Public transport becomes less competitive for those people.
Mm-hmm. So we need to get 50% more of trips off the road. And well, in terms of getting more people to share their car, getting more people to into active travel into public transport. Okay, so that's super clear. In terms of the ambition, I mean, a lot of your slides talk about ambition and the lowering of ambition, I would say. I mean, are we in a place where it's a bit tricky given everything that's happening last week in terms of weakening green policies, but do you think something needs to change in terms of getting more radical in terms of what can be delivered, in terms of, incentivization, perhaps maximizing subsidy? I mean, if you look at Europe, you've got obviously €49 rail passes for monthly travel on all trains. You've got massive investment in car sharing. You've got France banning short haul flights. Are these the type of things that really need to come through? And if they're not going to come through in this current government, we should be lobbying as a group for it to come through in the next.
Well, I think it's a really important set of questions that, given the scale of the gap that we've got, and given the time scale that we've got, so, if you think really we've got to make, we've got to try and get back on track in the next 7 years or so, what can we do quickly? We can't build lots of solutions quickly, because it will take us that long to get them through the planning process if they're not, kind of spades in the ground investments in mass rapid transit and so on. So what is it that we can do quickly? I think we can do walking and cycling investment quickly. I think we can change how much we pay for public transport quickly. We can change the efficiency of the use of the network through car sharing. And I think this is where employers and the public sector are going to have to come together. Employers also have commitments to net zero, and they're spending money. Each company's spending money in its own particular way. The university's the same, ambitious climate plan, set aside quite a lot of money to spend on it. But really, actually, we're going to have to pull this together, because, let's be honest, we can talk about major public transport fare reform, but at the moment, we're staring at local authorities going into administration. So where is the money in the public sector to pay for the kind of level of ambition we're talking about countrywide? So I think we really need this partnership between companies and the public sector to be working to pull together attractive offers and opportunities to try and bring the kind of business low carbon agenda together with the public sector low carbon agenda, to just try and maximize what we have got available. I mean, I'd love it if we had a magic wand and we could indeed go for much more ambitious public transport fares, but we've got to have an honest conversation about where the money for that is going to come from. And I'm just not seeing that happen in the current environment. I'm not saying it shouldn't happen. I'm not saying I wouldn't like it to happen. It is not happening.
No, very true. I mean, the comment in here is, do we need a £49 per month Great Britain ticket? I mean, that would be fantastic, but it's the harsh truths and realities of economics in terms of how that might be delivered, although it's being delivered in Germany. So perhaps we need to be understanding more about how it's happening in other countries. There's a few comments here. It's sort of in that kind of same space about sort of maximizing subsidies. So why can't there be a more strategic approach to the incentivization of alternatives to the car, public transport, e-bikes, e-scooters, etc.? A sort of a transport for all policy at minimum cost, maximum subsidy. I don't know if you have a thought on terms of how do we get to that point of transport for all?
I mean, I do think we need some radical experiments. If you look at places like Vienna that started with a €365 ticket for the whole city, I mean, essentially what you're trying to do is to get everyone to buy in that public transport is sometimes for them. And then some people will use it intensively and some people will use it less intensively, and it becomes a more affordable model. But I think, it's also going to require more subsidy than we currently put in. So I think with that will come a need for greater accountability for the money. So I think, places like Manchester that have moved on the B network and being able to take the running of the buses and well, specifying the service anyway in-house will have that accountability and can maybe be the places where we start trying that. But yeah, it's difficult with the current model, how you channel that money to private operators in a way that's consistent with the market that we've decided 30 years ago or 40 years ago was a good idea. Difficult.
Agreed. Just bear with me. I'm just looking through. There's lots of questions coming through, which is fab. They're in two spots, Q&A and chat. So I'm just having to ditch between the two.
Rather you than me.
Here's an interesting one. Many devolved and local authorities are publishing vehicle mile reduction targets, often 10 to 20%. What's your view on long commutes that cross borders? How might these be counted and how might they be addressed? Now, I do know that there is work obviously underway across the STPs in terms of recognising more conclusively the carbon associated with trips and where they're from. So whether they're within a region or flowing through a region, origin is outside the region, endpoint is in the region. So I think that's probably going to help. I think that's quite imminent in terms of documentation that's going to be available for authorities. Do you have any sense on that, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, the combined authorities generally operate at that kind of scale anyway. I mean, I know there are still some authorities where you have significant cross-boundary commuting. I would say work with your employers. They're the people to whom these people are seeking to get to, and therefore understanding, is there a significant flow across several employers from outside your local authority to the local authority area that you can work on. I mean, I guess I'd rather see a target for commuting within an area if that's all the authority can specify than no target at all. At least it's a commitment to getting on with stuff, and then you can build further ambition around that. I mean, I think you're right, Graham. The supporting data is going to be made available by the subnational transport bodies, so we definitely shouldn't be trying to recreate things that other people have got.
No, I think they're going to be particularly useful. I guess from a Mobility Ways perspective as well, obviously the work we do almost exclusively with large organisations, both public and private, lends itself to us finding out a lot more about where those trips originate from into the office, the frequency, the duration. And I think there's an increasing requirement for areas, the major anchor institutions. So what you've obviously articulated already in terms of the impact of just emissions from Leeds as an example, based on those three sectors. When you add in maybe 3 or 4 key employers as well, suddenly you're into a really big space and a really massive amount of employees. If you can understand them better, you can probably extrapolate up from that to give you something which will actually give you real rich context in terms of where those trips are starting and what does that mean in terms of reduction from that point onwards. Okay. I think there's some others here, which I think there's a couple of questions here which are going to be quite much more related to the next presentation, which is around an update on local transport plans, some innovation, and we'll probably from that we'll form a few questions which we can then come out into a third sort of wrap-up Q&A as well. So what I might suggest is we stop it there. Thank you so much for that, Greg, and maybe we move on to now to Craig and to Joe to give us some real-life insights in terms of how the local transport plan is being driven, the key actions that are arising from that, and importantly, the role of innovation. So perhaps, Craig and Joe, over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, if we could go on to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a quick policy overview of our local transport plan, and then Craig's going to talk in more detail about a specific intervention coming out of that focused on commuting. So go to the next slide, please. So we adopted our new local transport plan, which we called the Local Transport and Connectivity Plan, in July last year. And it's our 5th local transport plan in Oxfordshire, replacing our LTP4 that was adopted in 2016. So we made that decision to update it for a number of reasons, such as changes to policy and funding, and to really account for new priorities such as decarbonisation. So our LTCP sets out the sort of high-level transport vision for Oxfordshire, and it sets out that our goal is to reduce the need to travel, to reduce private car use, and to make walking, cycling, public and shared transport the natural first choice. We identified a set of headline targets to help quantify that vision, and that includes a 25% trip reduction target by 2030, a target for a net zero transport network by 2040, and then a target to further reduce trips by another 30% by 2040, so looking at a 50% overall reduction. In order to achieve that, we've got 4 policies that cover a range of areas, all the way from walking and cycling through to digital connectivity. Just pulled out a few on the slide there that are particularly related to commuting. So we have a policy around a strategic active travel network. So that's thinking about our active travel network between towns and long distance journeys to complement the work of local cycling and walking infrastructure plans that very much look at within towns. So really thinking about strategic links, particularly the role of e-bikes and how commuting sort of between towns into urban centres could be facilitated. We have a travel to work policy, which is mainly focused on working with large employers to develop workplace travel plans. We have a mobility hubs policy. So we're planning to develop a network of mobility hubs. This is to sort of tackle a range of different journeys, different needs, but also to help reduce journey distance. So thinking about if we can intercept journeys earlier on to reduce the carbon impact and facilitate a change onto more sustainable modes. And then the last one I've picked out there is as the C in our local transport plan, we added to reflect the role of digital connectivity. And so we worked with our digital connectivity team to include some policies on digital connectivity, including a remote working policy, so looking to support and facilitate the expansion of the full fibre broadband to help support home working. So following the adoption last year, we've been working on specific area and corridor travel plans, which take sort of individual towns and road corridors and start to think how we apply the sort of high-level policies on a case-by-case basis. So our first area travel plan was developed for the central Oxfordshire, which covers the city of Oxford, and that was approved last year. So that very much starts to take these high-level policies and thinks how we apply them in different areas. And so I'm going to hand over to Craig who's going to talk through central Oxfordshire travel plan, and specifically one of the interventions in that that's closely linked to commuting.
Thank you very much, Joe. Can I have the next slide, please? Before I start, just to remind people, I'm Craig Rossington. I'm a senior transport planner at the County Council, and I work closely with policy colleagues like Joe, and also really helpful to have the policy context for the traffic filters, which is I guess you would say, is the sharp end of tackling the problem of traffic and carbon emissions at a local level. Just in terms of where they fit, the trial traffic filters that I'm going to talk about are part of this central Oxfordshire travel plan, and this is what we're hoping to achieve using this tool of traffic filters, or others might know them as bus gates, but it's much more than a bus gate. They're much more than bus gates. We're looking to see a flagship zero-emission bus network, improve bus services travelling at the speed limit throughout the day and the night, if possible. Comprehensive and safe cycle footpath network. We want to significantly reduce congestion on the roads and allow people to make journeys by car and van if they need to do that. We want to see beautifully designed streets and public spaces with clean air that people can enjoy. And we want to see livable neighbourhoods as well. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. We're aiming to lead the way as a council towards a Commute Zero through this intervention of traffic filters. It's really, really important. And I think it's worth just saying that right at the start, picking up on something that Greg talked about, I think, about what can we do, what can we deliver that's quick and doesn't involve huge sums of money and a large amount of infrastructure, neither of which are easy to get our hands on and deliver quickly. Well, traffic filters are relatively cheap and can be delivered very quickly. We think so. 6.5 million is what we're looking at for an intervention that will have the impact of many miles of bus lanes that would otherwise cost huge amounts of money and take a long time to deliver. So from that perspective, we think they're really important to try and lead the way in this transport sector. So it's really good to have the policy context from Joe. It's worth saying that the traffic filters are working alongside other big policy interventions, like our plans for a zero emission zone across the city centre. We already have a pilot zero emission zone in the city centre. We want to expand that across the whole city centre, and also to see the introduction of a workplace parking levy across the whole city. There've been policy, actually, though, not new things. There's been a great deal of modelling assessment over the past 7 or 8 years since they were first introduced into our policy framework. And of course, there's been huge amounts of public and stakeholder engagement and consultation, and that culminated in a decision by our county council cabinet to introduce the traffic filters on a trial basis next autumn. They've not been without controversy when such change is involved. You may even have heard about the proposals in the national and even the international media, and we're not even just talking about our low traffic neighbourhoods in Oxford, which featured on a panorama programme not so long ago. Well, what are they? Well, they're points on the road network through which vehicles can't pass unless there's certain categories. In a sense, in simple terms, cars can't drive through them, but all other vehicles can. But cars are obviously a huge part of the problem with traffic in the city. So cars can't drive through the filters except if they have a permit, and we'll talk about permits, but all of the vehicles can. So taxis, buses, coaches, vans, mopeds, motorbikes, HGVs can go through at all times, and that's why we're not calling them bus gates. ANPR cameras will monitor them and enforce the restrictions. So they're points on a road, they're signed, so very small amount of civil engineering needed, and no huge amounts of bus. They apply for a permit to allow them to drive through all of the filters on up to 100 days a year, and then people living outside of the city but in the county will be able to apply for a permit that allows them to drive through the filters on up to 25 days each year. We do believe that the filters will have a really significant positive impact on how people commute into and around the city. They're not just aimed, I think it's worth pointing this out as well before I move on, just the county council car commuting in the city, of our staff, of the county staff. There's been very little of that within the city for county council staff. And whilst we have been implementing a number of innovative schemes over the last 20, 30, even 40 years in the city to tackle problems associated with traffic and commuting in the city, we have very limited road space. In Oxford, perhaps as much as anywhere else, and there's a huge demand for travel into Oxford.
Well, have we lost you, Craig? I think we might have lost Craig.
Yeah, I think we've lost Craig.
He's back. Hopefully back.
Can I have the next slide, please?
We keep losing you a little bit, Craig, unfortunately, but hopefully,
Yeah.
maybe come off camera, because maybe that will just increase the bandwidth your side. So
Yeah.
either way.
So, can you hear me now?
Yes, hear you well.
You can hear me. Okay, good. So what will they achieve? Well, they'll make walking and cycling safer and more attractive. They're going to make bus journeys quicker and more reliable. That's what people want to see. They're going to enable new and improved buses. We've got 159 fully electric buses. Reduce local air pollution.
Sorry, Craig, you're cutting in and out. We can't get a lot of what you're saying, unfortunately. I mean, Joe, you might have a slightly better connection. Are you able to just cover off a few bits?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I'll talk through what's there. As Chris said, I'm not sure what people could make out. So yeah, I'll just cover off the traffic filters.
Hello.
Hopefully, make walking and cycling more attractive, make buses quicker and more reliable. So I think, as Craig was referring to, that we've got a fleet of electric buses coming in.
Can you hear me?
We can, Craig.
Not too well. So Joe's just going to try and take a little bit of the strain for now, Craig.
Yeah, so we've got for the Zebra scheme, a fleet of electric buses coming in. So speeding them up for the traffic filters will be a really important step. And supporting investment in the buses. And then helping to tackle local air pollution, and improving the health and well-being of our communities. So next slide, please. So from the modelling conducted, the traffic filters are expected to reduce traffic levels by around 20% across the city within the ring road, and reduce traffic levels by more than a third within the city centre. The improvements to bus journey times will hopefully increase park and ride use by around 10%, and then that will enable new and improved bus routes. The sort of reduction in traffic will hopefully lead to a reduction in accidents by around 15% in the city, as well as the air quality improvements mentioned. And then again, hopefully by freeing up road space, there'll be an increasing walking and cycling trips by around 10%. Next slide, please.
Right, can you hear me now, Joe?
We can, if you want to try again, Craig. Okay.
Want me to give it another crack?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, I've rejoined. Huge apologies. Internet looks all fine here, but obviously not working. So can we just go back one slide, please? Did Joe talk about this? This is what we're hoping to achieve.
He did.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Well, one thing just to add is that we're expecting carbon emissions, CO2 emissions to reduce by about 6% in association with these measures. Can you still hear me?
Yep, all good.
Good. Okay, next slide, please. Finally, we have a map of Oxford. You can see Oxford in the background. We're talking 6 traffic filters on key parts of the road network. They're not just residential streets. Low traffic neighbourhoods tackle the streets. Someone's saying they can't see the slides. I don't know if that's just one person or all people. We have 6 traffic filters, 4 in the city centre and 2 on the outer edge, where there's significant amounts of car traffic and congestion, which is affecting how people commute to work in particular. Operating 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. 7 days a week in the city centre, and during core commuting hours just Monday to Saturday on the outside of the city, although we can change that to 7 AM to 7 PM if monitoring shows that that's necessary. Next slide, please. This just talks about sort of the nitty-gritty of who can apply for a permit to drive a car through the traffic filters. So all those other vehicles on the right-hand side are automatically exempted because they're not cars. But if you're a car, you can still drive through if you're a blue badge holder, if you're professional health and care worker, non-professional carers, and a good number of other things there as well, including car club vehicles. And cars used as goods vehicles by Oxford businesses as well, taxis and private hires. And this will help us to significantly reduce the amount of traffic on the road network as a whole throughout the day. Next slide, please. And there you can see the areas in which you can apply for a permit. The right-hand side is the Oxford permit area. The left-hand side, you can see that Oxford permit area, dark grey in the middle of Oxfordshire as a whole. And as I said before, if you live within the city, you can apply for permits to drive through each and every filter on up to 100 days and 25 days if you live outside of the city but within the county. It's nowhere near enough for you to commute within Oxford by car on a daily basis, especially not if you live outside of the city. But there is an incentive there potentially for people, and one sort of behaviour change could be that people who live similar sort of areas could pool their permits together in order to car share, in order to drive to work if they so wish. Car sharing being a good outcome, even if we'd like to see more people on buses. And similarly for journeys to school as well, I believe one of the behaviour changes may well be that parents living in similar areas may pull together their permits to drive a private car through the traffic filters. I could have the next slide, please. So the big question, of course, is when will they start? We're not expected they're not expected to start until after major works that are carrying on at the moment at the Oxford railway station are completed, which has closed fully one of the main radial routes coming into the city centre along Botley Road. But that work is expected to end next autumn, and that's when we'll trial the traffic filters using an experimental traffic regulation order, which means that for a minimum of 6 months and maybe up to 18 months total maximum, we will be trialling the traffic filters, and there's a possibility that we can make some minor changes during that period. We're carrying out a huge amount of monitoring and evaluation we will be carrying out a huge amount of monitoring and evaluation of the success of the trial traffic filters. We're in the process of collecting an awful lot of before data at the moment, and the experimental traffic regulation order, as many of you will know, it will form itself a formal consultation for at least 6 months, and the feedback from that, along with the monitoring and evaluation, will be considered by the County Council's Cabinet before making a decision about whether to go permanent with the traffic filters. And there's much more information on our website. We do believe this is highly innovative. It's brave. You may be aware of the scheme in Ghent, where they've introduced measures to prevent vehicles crossing the city centre. The area that affects is actually much smaller than the area that we're talking about here. They have an inner ring road, which can be used for trips across the city. After the traffic filters, the next way to drive across the city is the ring road, Oxford's ring road, and that is much further and therefore encompasses a much larger area than Ghent. So if you think Ghent is brave and at the forefront, well, Oxford is trying to go a significant step further than that in order to tackle commuting and just generally tackling the problems we have associated with so much traffic and congestion in the city centre. But as I said before as well, a much cheaper and much quicker way of doing it, albeit it does feel like it's been a hard and long journey to get to the point where we are today with an approval for these traffic filters. And I think that's the end. I think the last slide just shows you the jigsaw, which is showing you the traffic filters and one of a number of different things we're trying to do in the city as part of our local transport connectivity plan that Jay talked about. And that's not all of the actions there. There are 22 actions in total, but a number of things with traffic filters, workplace parking levy and zero emission zone are very much right up there in terms of the impact that we are planning to have on travel, including commuting. Thanks very much. Apologies for the problems with tech.
Connectivity, always a challenge. Thank you so much, Craig. I mean, I'll continue on sort of some of the questions around the specific scheme first, and then maybe jump back into some of the policy stuff. But I'm fascinated by how it came to be. How did traffic filters as an idea? How was it born? Who was involved? And maybe a little bit more detail about sort of the challenges along the way, because obviously it's still, what we're talking, sort of a year away from launch. Noting that obviously other councils in the past have gone down a route of implementing something and then have reversed their decision on those things. Where is the level of comfort in terms of this seeing the light of day? I'm sure it is, but just generally, how have you got to that point where you've got that comfort and everyone's bought in? I'm really fascinated by that.
I mean, there is a long history of innovation and sort of being at the leading edge of transport planning and taking action to tackle sort of limited road space and too much traffic and congestion and so on. In the early 70s, the county and city councils introduced a balanced transport policy, which led to the first park and ride in the world, basically. Back in 1997, we introduced a bus gate on the high street and a number of other traffic restriction points in the city centre to create a bus priority route. So very similar tool to the one that we're looking now to employ more strategically. So we tackled travel to the city centre. So it's not hugely new and innovative as a tool, but the way in which we're using it across the whole city to tackle traffic more strategically in the city is new. We did a review of the Oxford Transport Strategy, which led to the sort of most recent version of which led to the high street bus gate and the bus priority route in the city centre back in the late 90s, 1999. We did a review of that, probably not the first review, but a big review of that in 2015 as part of our local transport plan. We worked with Atkins on that and members, and that led to considering some pretty serious transport demand management measures. And we looked at congestion charge. That wasn't seen as being the most equitable way to go, and has sort of time limited effects, as we know in London, albeit there are some benefits as well. And the transport demand management measure that we felt was most appropriate was the traffic filters, and alongside a workplace parking levy and other measures to tackle air pollution in the form of zero emission zone. I think what it's seen the light of day, I think, because we've had politicians who supported and endorsed officer recommendations and led the way in terms of what they're trying to achieve. So I think that's been hugely helpful, and that's politicians of all colours, it has to be said, as well. So the previous administration involving Conservatives, that they in fact kicked off transport demand management in the form of traffic filters in earnest. Actually, it's now being continued with the current administration. So a number of reasons. So it's not come out of the blue. It's been a long road though, as he said.
Fantastic. I mean, you've highlighted a number of other things. I mean, the workplace levy. I mean, is that where is that in sort of the planning process? Is that going to come through into Oxfordshire as well?
It's a good question. We did. I'm trying to think. Back in autumn 2019, we did pretty intensive stakeholder engagement on the three what we call core schemes, which is traffic filters, zero emission zone, and workplace parking levy. So we presented those as the three interventions we wanted to take forward. There's a lot of interest, a lot of concern as well. We continue to press on with plans. The workplace parking levy is further behind. We've got lots of work to do, modelling and assessment and planning work for that, and obviously lots of consultation as well. Zero emission zone, as I said, I think briefly said, the pilot, which covers 9 streets in the heart of the city centre, was introduced in February last year. as a way of testing how we could roll it out across the whole city centre. So that's much further forward than workplace parking levy. Traffic filters is the next big thing we want to do, followed by zero emission zone, workplace parking levy after that. More work to be done, but we recognise that it's worked well in Nottingham, and it's been dropped in a couple of notable examples in terms of Leicester and Bristol and so on. So we continue to work on it for the time being, at least.
The monitoring and evaluation aspect of all of this project obviously is key. I've seen a few questions about how that's going to work. I mean, also some simple things. I mean, you mentioned Park and Ride being an innovator in that space. I mean, how does Park and Ride work in Oxford is a question. And I guess I think you referenced 10% increase you're looking or hoping for as a consequence of traffic filters. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about Park and Ride.
Well, Park and Ride, as I said before, has a very long history in the city, and I think a number of people who've got it elsewhere will probably we'll have us to thank to a degree. I could take all the credit for that, but it's a really crucial. A lot of people travel from outside of the city into the city, as they obviously do in many other places, but in particular Oxford because of the price of housing, huge attraction for jobs and all sorts of the reasons why people want to travel into Oxford. So Park and Ride is an absolutely critical part of the sort of the transport mix. Many people don't have direct services from their village or wherever else they live outside of the city, so it's really crucial part. We're very much expecting that the buses, as we reduce traffic within the city, the Park and Ride will benefit from that, as well as services coming in from the outside, trunk routes that we have from places like Swindon, Tame and other sort of towns, Abingdon and so on, which suffer congestion not just on the approaches but very much within the city as well. So the bus is a crucial part of all this. 10% increase in Park and Ride and general bus use. When you put that together with the increases we're expecting from walking and cycling as well, we do believe we're going to have a big impact on the way people travel.
Just to pick up on Park and Ride, if I could quickly, we're also thinking about how it evolves moving forward. So I mentioned mobility hub. We're definitely thinking how Park and Ride very much is encouraging driving to a point and then onto bus, but are very much thinking about now mobility hubs and how they can sort of evolve and sort of support more of a variety of modes and more of a variety of functions, be that remote working, freight consolidation. So we're very much looking at them as a sort of core part of our mobility hub network and how they can continue to evolve to sort of better support sustainable transport more generally, as well as just bus to car transfer. That's
a really interesting point, Joe. Yeah, I mean, I've used some of those Park and Ride in Oxford specifically for charging, to be honest. Charging, but then quick nip into town as well. But I think more services that can allow people to convene there and not actually need to even come into the city centre, but meet in Oxford. I think will be incredibly useful. Another part on this sort of evaluation piece is the concern potentially that this might just push people out into the ring road. So how because people love their cars. There's a massive behaviour change piece that we've got to do here. So how do we stop them going, okay, I can't drive through, I'll just go round?
It's a fair point. That's one of the biggest biggest message we've had in terms of feedback from people at an early stage, and when we're actually proposing things in detail last autumn. Clearly, the monitoring will tell us how much that happens. We know that there will be some diversion of traffic. Of course, if you're travelling from one side of Oxford to the other, you can still travel on the ring road. No one's banning cars. You can get to all parts of the city by car. You just can't travel through the traffic filter points themselves. But it will take you a longer time compared to your journey directly through the traffic filter points. So on the basis that the bus journeys, walking and cycling on the most direct route will be much more attractive. Buses will run quicker and more reliably. Walking and cycling will be safer and more attractive. There'll be some people who continue to drive. We totally accept that. But there's many other people who at the moment would like to walk and cycle, to catch the bus, but just don't feel it's suitable for them to get their kids to school or to get to work reliably on time. So we really do expect, we've done lots of technical work on this with our consultant partner Steer and others, looking at what impact this will have on behaviour change. We've modelled it using the Saturn model for the city at a strategic level. But the monitoring and evaluation is very detailed. It's all there on our website. If you just Google up Oxfordshire, Oxford traffic filters, you'll find our traffic filter page. All the background information is on there, including now our monitoring evaluation plan, how we're going to assess whether or not this is successful. And there's lots of detail in there for those of you who are interested.
One more on this, and I'll just go on to a bit more of the strategy stuff. Is you mentioned behaviour change, and there's a fantastic question here. How are you planning on communicating this idea? Well, it's more than an idea; it's pretty formed now to local residents in order for them to see it as a positive rather than an inconvenience. I guess part of that also is like, how did you come across, the 100 and the 25 limit? How did you get to that point? I mean, obviously the behaviour change piece is massive. We know there's underinvestment in this area. It's the key to getting more of us to use our car less. Just interested in kind of how you're planning on rolling it out from a communication perspective.
Yeah, thanks. And obviously we've done lots of engagement with public stakeholders already, and that's been really helpful to help us to understand what people are struggling with, what people think are potentially exciting about it as well. We continue to do that, and will continue to do that. You're absolutely right. Comms is critical to this, and we're working very closely with our comms team as to how we can do this, whether that's a countdown, explaining everything to people. I found when I go and talk to businesses in particular, because they're a really key stakeholder, we've got a business partnership I was speaking at recently, and actually when they were able to listen to a presentation not dissimilar to what I was talking about, talking to today, they actually seem to get it and realise it's perhaps not as bad as the sort of the mainstream media or perhaps more to the point the conspiracy theorists have been saying it is. And actually it's a relatively small amount of behaviour change to adapt and to be able to cope with this and actually make it work quite well for people. So it's about communicating to people. One of the things you get, and you seem to think people are taking this, is that we're sort of asking them not to drive a car and use public transport and walking, cycling as it is now. Oh, how you expect me to do this? Because I tried the bus the other day, one of them didn't turn up, the next one was late, and then it took an hour and a half to get to where I want to. How are you expecting me to leave my car at home when that's the alternative? The point is, of course, is that you can still drive if you want to, but the alternative, because we're introducing the traffic filters, will be so much better than it is at the moment. So trying to get people to understand what it will be like and not to be scared of that, and actually to see the benefits is one of the really big challenges for us. So we've got lots of work to do on that. I think that's definitely fair to say.
And you mentioned the sort of the grouping of permits. If I live outside, but actually,
you asked about the numbers. Yeah, where do the numbers come from?
Could that be? No, I'm thinking more actually about.
Pooling.
Me and two others. Well, that's 300 permits. So actually, reflecting on that as a chance for me to then share up with a couple of people. Would that be a strategy or something that you will say to people, or really you don't really want them to be coming in with cars? So it's more about just get to the park and ride site and share a car with three of you. Why not?
I think it's I mean, it's an interesting question. Do we push that really hard, or do we wait to see that that's a behaviour change that people work out? It's car sharing at the end of the day, if that's how it works, and that's a good outcome for us. I guess ideally people will be on buses, because that's even more efficient. But that would be about if a good chunk did that kind of carpooling, the school run. If you can imagine, you cut down the number of cars outside schools. That's got to be a good outcome as well. So. And getting kids to school and public transport, smaller kids in particular, isn't always realistic for lots of people. The 100 and the 25, good question. I mean, the original scheme didn't have any residence permits, didn't have any of those at all. Done a lot of consultation, a lot of engagement, and clearly this whole concept is a difficult thing for people to accept. So I think it's fair to say that that these were as a result of feedback we received. And obviously we did the modelling of them to understand, at what level could we set the number of permits but still get the right outcomes in terms of reducing traffic and congestion. So yeah, it's how a scheme has evolved, I think, through sort of the process.
And last, is there any has a price been fixed in terms of what you'll be charged if you go over your limit or don't have a permit?
Well, if you go over your limit, you then will you will not be allowed to drive through the traffic filters, so you'll just get a penalty charge notice. for driving through, which I think be £70, £35 on prompt payment.
Right.
Yeah, but of course you can always avoid them if you want to. You'll have an account. You'll know how many permits, how many day passes you've got left on your permit.
Got it. And then, so just on the strategy side. So Joe, quite a few questions around sort of the updates of LTPs. So people are looking for the DFT guidance, which is sitting on a desk, and whether or not it will appear or not is another matter. But in essence, updates are routine anyway on local transport plans. Where councils, where peers are going through that process of updating, with or without maybe some of this quantifiable carbon reduction stuff that we are waiting for, but we'll see if it comes to light. But I mean, from your perspective, what should local plans really focus on to ensure they support the decarbonisation agenda?
Yeah, I think, and it was a challenge for us, and part of the reason we've taken the approach of doing the area specific work, secondly, is so that we can then use STB tools to test our policy framework and work exactly how it's applied. So yeah, that's part of why we took this approach of not going into all the detail at this stage. I mean, from our experience, I think sort of what I guess would be some key areas to focus on was, one is around healthy place shaping. We have a whole chapter on it this year that has never been included before in local transport plans, really thinking about the human and the planning aspect as well and try to bring that in. And similarly, community activation. So really thinking about not just the infrastructure, I think going beyond that, recognizing that for years we've been providing infrastructure, but really trying to support that with supporting measures to address those barriers that people have to using alternative modes, trying to understand that better. Try to think more generally about how we design our places and our streets to support decarbonisation, rather than simply just providing cycle lanes, bus lanes. So really trying to broaden that out, I think, was a key thing we felt from feedback in consultation. But people often highlighting their barriers to use, as Craig sort of alluded to, as opposed to sort of opposition to any of the policies or not having the infrastructure in many cases. So I think that was quite a key area for us that we felt was important to have. Demand management, we do have policies on it. And as we sort of talked today, I think we feel that it is an essential step to get to net zero, and that some of those tougher measures will be needed. So we have policy to support that, and also now we're seeking to apply that already for the traffic filters. So I mean, they're sort of two quite key areas. Yeah, and then sort of thinking about the different trip purposes. So as we sort of hear today talking about commuting, and as I mentioned earlier, we have a policy thinking about active travel more strategically, so recognizing that there are different trip purposes and that a lot of our active travel work is traditionally looked at within towns, but not necessarily thinking about from rural areas particularly to urban centres. So from around Oxford into Oxford from the rural surrounds, with other large towns like Banbury that have very large rural hinterlands. So really starting to think of those more strategic active travel journeys and how we can support with, for example, e-bikes, longer commuting trips by active travel. So sort of thinking about those different journey purposes and the sort of types of different intervention that might be needed.
That's really heartening. I mean, certainly a lot of conversations I've been having with councils of late have really kind of started to amplify that sort of being the ambassador for place and communities. So taking it, like you say, beyond the infrastructure provision into a behavioural change world, which recognises then the use cases. And I think maybe in a minute or two we'll bring Greg back in as well, because I think we're sort of hitting the sort of the wrap up Q&A piece around this being about mobility for all. I think I'm really resonating what you're saying there, Joe, in terms of you've had a strategic local transport plan, but then you're breaking it down into areas, and what does that mean at a singular place or within a community? So I think that's really interesting to hear. There was a question maybe you want to just jump back on again, Greg. Maybe we'll have another 10 minutes. Yeah, this whole piece about mobility for all. Lots of questions about rural versus urban. There's stuff you can do in urban centres which you can't do in rural. You know, incredible, obviously, car dependency within rural areas because public transport is so poor, and provision is that's the place where it's being cut. I guess with that sort of rural and urban environment sort of paradox that we're living in, how do we deliver sort of mobility for all? What are the solutions that can sort of break that down? What do we need to be looking at? Any thoughts?
I could jump in. I briefly alluded to it earlier, but I think one intention we're looking at is mobility hubs and smaller mobility hubs. And to some extent, if we can, knowing that the majority of our emissions are from longer car journeys, if we can intercept them earlier and just start breaking down some of that distance, so even if it is driving from a rural area to on a strategic road corridor, a mobility hub to then take an onward bus, onward train. I think that's one. Obviously, in an ideal world, we'll have walking, cycling to those hubs, but there's a sort of a second sort of byproduct mechanism. It's really not feasible to do anything other than drive to start cutting down the journey distances to reduce the carbon impact. And that's one sort of intervention, one slightly different approach we've been looking at and looking to develop further.
That's, yeah, very interesting. Yeah,
there's places in Denmark have very good connections between their rural areas for e-bikes. You know, the distances that people can travel by e-bike significantly longer than normal bike rides, so that opens up more space. I think it's basically going to require a big mix of different things, and I don't think we should be looking for parity between urban and rural. I can't see how we'll achieve that, but you know, maybe that means we should be thinking about electrifying faster in rural areas and urban areas, where at the moment most of the incentives that are driving EV purchase, or the additional ones around, you know, parking charges or ULEZ, would tend to incentivize people driving into the middle of the cities, not necessarily targeting rural mileage. But they're again, looking back at the kind of public sector involvement, there was an interesting case, the enterprise working with I can't remember, it was Derbyshire Council, looking at making available car club vehicles in some of their more smaller centres that are away from the main headquarters, which they use for the fleet during the day, but they're available to the public at night. You know, we can think about carpooling in a range of different areas. I guess it's not always necessarily looking for the public transport solution. We've got to think about a different blend, and you know, the point that was made about focusing that around mobility hubs and trying to make the most of where public transport works best seems like a great way forward as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting piece when you think about electrification. You know, in rural areas, you know, you then have the added challenge of you might have off-street parking, but the difficulty in potentially actually kitting that house up with a home charger, which means that mobility hubs centered around with some electric vehicle charging points that can be used by that local community will be really, really powerful and really useful. And like you say, can actually really cut down miles driven. The CO2 emission basis around that's interesting. In terms of, it's been mentioned around sort of business engagement and partnerships and the like. I mean, it feels like there's still more to be done in terms of getting the largest employers, of which local authorities is one, but then, as we mentioned, education, NHS, big private organisations, to be the leaders. From an Oxfordshire perspective, I mean, how are you engaged? I think you mentioned something about business engagement. How is that working? What learnings can you provide, perhaps, from what you've done, and what else needs to be done?
Yeah, thanks. Back in 2019, and that when we did an engagement with stakeholders then at that stage, one of the things that came out of that for the workplace parking levy in particular was something called the Workplace Parking Levy Partnership. And at that point, the workplace parking levy was going to be focused on the eastern part of the city, where there's a huge amount of commuter car parking and congestion and so on. And we got together a number of the key employers in that area, who, according to the scheme as it was designed at that stage, would have been paying the workplace parking levy. And we sort of said, look, let's get together. Let's hear from you how you think we should be spending this money. If you're going to be paying this money, how do you think we should be spending it to help you to reduce the impacts of your commuting? The scheme has changed since then, albeit there's still a lot of work to do on it. It now covers the whole city, which is partly as a result of the things that people said on that workplace parking levy partnership. But the meeting I was at recently was something called the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership. It's a partnership of, I can't remember how many it is now, but it's quite a number of the big employers in Oxford and just surrounding. So BMW, the NHS, the universities, the business parks, those kind of organisations, and it's a great grouping of businesses who can see it. Certainly with the traffic filters now, could see it's coming and know that they need to get ready for it. Are pleased, I think, on that last kind of outing we had, that it's perhaps not quite as severe as they perhaps feared it was going to be, and want to work together. They're all pretty much signed up on that partnership to zero carbon, as the name suggests, and so they're sold on the idea that they need to do something and keen to work with us to hear how that can happen. So lots more work to be done. It's involved lots of webinars and things with small and big employers, and some of the small businesses are finding this a bit more difficult to get their heads around, but lots of work been done already, more to be done.
That's really interesting. I mean, I've heard of other sort of similar groups, sustainability groups, anchor institutions coming together. I guess what needs to come from that then is a commitment to perhaps a little bit of budget within those groups to actually then take some ideas forward. But that's really heartening to hear. All right, last one, I guess, was, I mean, it was mentioned. So commuting obviously came out as sort of the top in your wheel there, Greg, in terms of top trip, albeit once you group some other stuff together and under leisure, then leisure becomes sort of the number one trip in terms of duration, in terms of mileage. I think, yeah, this is about Commute Zero, but I think I'm very mindful also of Trip Zero. I think that's really where we're all sort of heading, and getting, fundamentally, we need to get more people to use their car less. So I think hopefully today has given some insights in terms of why that's so important. Thank you, Greg, for showing that there needs to be more ambition. Hopefully this has channeled some further impetus towards that. Thank you, Craig and Joe, for some really great insights, and a fantastic innovation, which I'm looking to hear more from other councils who might be looking to take some of these innovations forward. So I think that probably does us justice. How do we close off? Do we just say thank you very much?